A billionaire dumps girlfriend for being poor. Her transformation stuns the entire city. It was a crisp evening in the heart of the city, the kind where the lights of the skyscrapers reflected off the glassy streets, and the noise of traffic seemed far away in the plush corner of the penthouse. Catherine, a striking young woman with the kind of beauty that could stop conversations in their tracks, sat on the edge of a sofa in the luxurious living room of Victor Westfield, a self-made billionaire. Her fingers nervously played with the hem of her dress, her heart racing. She had been here countless times before, in this exact spot, yet tonight felt different. Victor, who had built his empire from the ground up, stood near the window, his back turned to her. He wasn't looking at the skyline. He was focused on something else entirely. His thoughts, the final decision that had been lingering in his mind for weeks. He was the kind of man who took what he wanted, controlled everything in his life, and had never been afraid to make tough decisions. But today, the weight of this choice seemed heavier than anything he had encountered. "I think it's time we end this, Catherine," Victor said, his voice low and cold. Catherine looked up, startled, her lips parted in confusion. "What do you mean, end this?" Her voice shook slightly as the words slipped from her mouth. Victor turned around to face her, his expression hardening. He was always so composed, so in control. But tonight, even he couldn't hide the disappointment in his eyes. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, his tone unwavering. "You've been a great companion, but you don't fit into my world anymore. We come from two completely different places, Catherine. I can't live this lie any longer. You're not the woman I need." The air felt thick as Catherine's mind raced, trying to process his words. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, she thought she might choke on her own breath. Her eyes flicked toward the glittering diamonds she wore around her neck, the ones he had bought for her just a month ago. The expensive clothes, the lavish dinners, the luxurious trips to the French Riviera. Was this really happening? Victor stepped closer, his gaze scanning her with a sense of finality. "You've never really understood my world, Catherine. You've never been part of the elite circle that I'm in. You're just not cut out for it. You've come from nothing, and no matter how hard you try, I don't think you'll ever truly fit in." His words stung like a slap in the face, but Catherine held her ground. She had come from nothing. Her life had been one of struggle, of scraping by from paycheck to paycheck. But this wasn't supposed to be her reality anymore. This wasn't what she had worked for, what she had dreamed of. She had earned this life of luxury, had fought for it. And yet, here she was, being tossed aside like a trophy that had lost its shine. "Is this about money, Victor? Is this really about me not being rich enough for you?" Catherine's voice trembled with disbelief. Victor sighed and shook his head. "It's not about the money. It's about the fact that you're not in the same league as me. You're from the streets. And in my world, that's not something that can be overlooked." For a moment, Catherine said nothing. The silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of their words. She could feel the heat of the anger rising in her chest, but instead of lashing out, she stood up slowly, trying to steady herself. "I've given you everything," Catherine said, her voice steadying. "And this is how you repay me? By saying I'm not good enough?" Victor didn't answer. He simply walked towards the door, not looking back, and in that moment, Catherine felt the life she had built around her crumble. Weeks passed, and the penthouse was quiet without Victor's presence. Catherine had been dismissed, discarded, and left to pick up the pieces of her life. The diamond necklace he had given her felt like a weight around her neck now, symbolizing everything that had come to an end. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, the beauty she had once flaunted now feeling like a mask that couldn't hide the pain inside. But there was something in her that refused to break. She had come from nothing before, and she could rise again. Catherine's first step was to reclaim her independence. She packed away the designer clothes that had once represented her newfound life of wealth. She removed the makeup, the heavy jewelry, and the luxurious gowns. It wasn't just about shedding the material wealth, it was about shedding the version of herself she had become, the version that had been built to please a man who had never truly appreciated her. It was time to rebuild. But this time, she would do it on her terms. She enrolled in a business management course, deciding that she would learn to create her own future, independent of anyone else. She rented a modest apartment, far from the penthouse she had lived in with Victor. She sold off the diamond necklace and other jewelry he had gifted her, not because she needed the money but because it symbolized a life that was no longer hers. As the weeks went on, Catherine transformed. She was no longer the woman who had sought validation from Victor or anyone else. She wasn't the woman who had lived in the shadow of his wealth. She was the woman who was learning to stand on her own. It wasn't long before news of her transformation spread. People who had known Catherine only for her relationship with Victor began to see a different side of her. She was no longer the socialite attending exclusive events. Instead, she was a self-made woman, working hard to build a career, independent of the man who had once controlled her life. Her story caught the attention of local business owners, and before long, she found herself receiving offers to work with various startups. Her education in business management opened doors, but it was her determination, her unrelenting desire to prove herself, that set her apart. People saw her not as the billionaire's former girlfriend but as a force to be reckoned with in her own right. One evening, while attending a networking event for young entrepreneurs, Catherine was approached by a well-dressed man who introduced himself as Julian Cross, the CEO of a fast-growing tech company. He had heard about her story and admired her ability to reinvent herself. "You're not the woman I've read about," Julian said with a smile. "The woman I've read about is someone who used to rely on others to succeed. But the woman standing before me is someone who's going to build her own empire." The words hit Catherine deeply. She was no longer someone defined by the past, she was creating her future. Victor, on the other hand, was struggling. He had tossed aside Catherine, assuming she was nothing more than a trophy to show off at events. But now, as he watched her rise from the ashes of their broken relationship, something began to gnaw at him. He couldn't deny the feeling of regret that began to creep in. She had proven him wrong. And as his company began to suffer from a string of bad decisions and increasing pressure from his investors, he began to wonder if his pride and arrogance had cost him more than just a relationship. Meanwhile, Catherine continued to thrive. The business connections she made led to more opportunities, and soon enough, she was at the helm of a new startup, one that catered to women who wanted to build businesses from the ground up. Her company became a success story that stunned the city. It was a story of redemption, of transformation, and of the indomitable spirit that no amount of money could ever buy. Catherine's rise was not just a personal victory, it became a symbol of strength for many others in the city. Those who had witnessed her relationship with Victor, the billionaire who had discarded her so callously, were now seeing her transform into a formidable force in the business world. She wasn't just bouncing back. She was thriving in ways that most people would never have imagined. Her business, which started as a small startup, quickly gained traction. Women's empowerment was at the heart of her mission. Catherine's company provided mentorship, funding, and resources for women who wanted to start their own businesses. She had been on the receiving end of disrespect when she was dismissed for being poor and unsuitable for Victor's world. Now, she was determined to give back, to ensure that other women would never have to feel the sting of judgment simply because of their financial status. Her story caught the attention of major media outlets, and Catherine was soon featured in interviews, articles, and documentaries. She had become the embodiment of resilience, of someone who had been knocked down only to rise stronger than before. The headlines were full of admiration, and social media buzzed with praise for the woman who had once been dismissed as a trophy and was now seen as a trailblazer. Her success wasn't without its challenges, of course. As her company grew, so did the pressure. Catherine often worked long hours, juggling multiple responsibilities as she expanded her team and secured new investors. But there was a sense of purpose behind her every move. She wasn't just building a company, she was building a legacy. Every decision she made, every deal she struck, was part of a bigger vision, to prove that a woman, no matter her background, could achieve anything. It wasn't long before Catherine's company became one of the top 5 most innovative startups in the city. Her name was synonymous with empowerment, and her work inspired countless women who had once felt invisible in the business world. She was often invited to speak at conferences, where her personal story resonated deeply with others. At one such conference in San Francisco, Catherine stood before a crowd of thousands. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, something that had once seemed out of her reach but was now a symbol of how far she had come. The spotlight was on her, and for the first time, she felt at home in it. "Just a few years ago, I was living a completely different life," Catherine began, her voice steady yet full of emotion. "I was told that I wasn't good enough, that my past, my background, my circumstances would always define me. I was made to believe that my worth was tied to someone else's success." The crowd listened intently as Catherine continued. "But what I've learned is that our worth isn't determined by others. It's determined by us. Our choices, our actions, and our resilience. We are all capable of breaking free from the constraints placed on us, of forging our own path, no matter where we start." The audience erupted into applause, the room filled with admiration and respect. Catherine had become a voice for those who had once been silenced, for those who had been told they couldn't achieve because of where they came from or what they had or didn't have. But as Catherine's star continued to rise, her past was never too far behind her. Victor, the billionaire who had discarded her so carelessly, was now watching from the sidelines, unable to ignore the seismic shift that had occurred. He had once been the one to decide who belonged in his world, and now, it seemed, he was the one on the outside. At a gala event, Victor found himself face to face with Catherine once more. It had been months since they had last spoken, and the memory of their parting still stung. He had assumed that she would crumble, that she would be just another casualty of his world. But here she was, standing in front of him, more powerful than ever. "Catherine," Victor said, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and something that bordered on regret. "Look different?" Catherine's gaze met his, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. She was no longer the woman who had sought his approval, the woman who had been desperate for his validation. She was someone entirely different now, someone stronger, more self-assured. "I've changed, Victor," Catherine said, her voice steady and calm. "And I've realized that I never needed your approval to succeed. I've done it on my own." Victor seemed taken aback, unsure of how to respond. He had always been the one in control, the one with the power. And yet, here she was, owning her success and standing on her own 2 feet. "I didn't expect this from you," Victor admitted, the words sounding almost like an apology. "I thought you would struggle without me." Catherine smiled softly, her eyes holding a mixture of pride and resolve. "You underestimated me, Victor. And that was your mistake." The conversation lingered for a few moments, each word an unspoken acknowledgement of the past. But for Catherine, there was no need to dwell on the mistakes of the man who had once held her back. She had moved on. As the months passed, Catherine's company continued to flourish. She had become not just a businesswoman but a philanthropist. Her work went beyond profits. She had started several initiatives to support underprivileged women, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. She was committed to helping others achieve their own success, just as she had done. Her transformation was not just personal, it was a catalyst for change in her city. Catherine had gone from being a woman dismissed for her lack of wealth to being a symbol of self-made success. And her success became a rallying cry for women everywhere, that their worth was not determined by their bank account or their past, but by their determination and drive. Meanwhile, Victor found himself in a different situation. His company, once thriving under his control, had begun to suffer. His arrogance and dismissal of those around him had led to a series of bad decisions. His investors were beginning to pull out, and his reputation was slowly deteriorating. He had never imagined that Catherine, whom he had discarded so easily, would be the one to leave him behind. But as he looked at her now, in all her success and glory, he realized the true cost of his choices. It wasn't just about losing a woman. He had lost a part of himself. He had allowed his pride and ego to define his actions, and in doing so, he had missed out on something real, something meaningful. Catherine had transformed into the very woman he had once overlooked, and now, he was the one paying the price for his arrogance. Months later, Catherine stood at the front of a packed conference hall, preparing for a keynote address at a major women's empowerment summit. Her company had grown beyond the city, and now she was sharing her story with women from all walks of life, women who had once felt that their dreams were out of reach. Catherine's message was clear: empowerment, independence, and resilience. She had built an empire, not with Victor's money or connections, but with her own hands. And she was determined to show others that they could do the same. As she took the stage, the crowd stood in ovation. Catherine was no longer just a woman who had been tossed aside by a man who thought she was too poor for his world. She was a leader, a trailblazer, and a beacon of hope for everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Victor had made a mistake. But Catherine? She had found her true worth, not in the glittering world he had promised her, but in the strength she had found within herself. As Catherine's company flourished, her journey took an unexpected turn. What had started as a personal quest for redemption had become something much larger than herself. She wasn't just creating a business anymore, she was building a movement. Her message of empowerment had struck a chord with women across the globe. Soon, her platform expanded beyond just business. It became about creating opportunities for self-discovery, confidence, and community. Catherine found herself traveling constantly, attending events, meeting with investors, and pushing her mission forward. Yet, despite the ever-growing demands of her career, she never lost sight of the core principles that had driven her success from the beginning. She was more than just a businesswoman, she was a role model, and with that responsibility came a constant need to inspire, lead, and empower others. Her company, which had begun with a single vision, now had a global reach. It was no longer just a startup, it had become a major player in the world of business and philanthropy. Catherine's impact on the tech and finance industries was undeniable. She'd established mentorship programs, educational scholarships, and career opportunities for women across the world. She was being recognized for her contributions not just in business, but in social change. Her work took her to London, where she was invited to give a keynote address at a prestigious women's summit. The event was held in one of the grandest venues in the city, and Catherine was seated among other high-profile speakers, including former heads of state and prominent business leaders. Her speech was the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice, a culmination of everything she had fought for. As Catherine took the stage, her heart raced. The crowd, packed with the world's most influential women, waited in anticipation. She had been in front of large crowds before, but this felt different. This was more than just a talk. It was the culmination of her personal transformation. "I'm not here today to talk about my success," Catherine began, her voice calm yet powerful. "I'm here because of you. Every woman in this room. Every woman who has struggled, who has been underestimated, who has had to fight to make herself heard." The crowd listened intently, leaning forward as she continued. "When I was left behind, discarded like an old accessory by the man who claimed to love me, I could have given up. I could have believed that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong. But instead, I chose to fight. I chose to rise. And today, I stand here not because of the wealth I've earned, not because of the power I hold, but because I believe in the potential of every single woman. We all have the ability to transform our lives. We all have the power to break free from the limits that others try to place on us." The crowd erupted into applause, and Catherine could feel the energy of the room shift. This was her moment, her chance to continue to inspire those who needed it most. This wasn't just a personal victory anymore. It was the victory of every woman who had ever been told she wasn't good enough. Back in the city, Victor sat in the penthouse that had once belonged to him and Catherine. The grandeur of the space felt empty now, its beauty tainted by the lingering guilt and regret that Victor couldn't shake off. He had followed his own path, built his own empire, but something was missing. What he had with Catherine had been real, but he had let his arrogance blind him to the connection they had shared. He had discarded her, assuming that she would never rise above her circumstances. But now, as he watched Catherine's global rise, he couldn't ignore the fact that he had underestimated her. Her name was everywhere, on the cover of magazines, in news reports, and across social media. She had transformed herself into something he hadn't expected, a self-made leader who didn't need his wealth or connections to succeed. Victor had tried to move on, but there were moments when he couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if he had treated Catherine differently. If he had seen her for who she truly was, beyond the labels of poor and insufficient. Instead, he had thrown away a relationship that could have brought them both to new heights. Now, the woman who had once been by his side was leading the world. In the weeks that followed the summit, Catherine's reputation grew exponentially. She was now being invited to collaborate with the world's leading organizations, from Google to Microsoft, to work on initiatives aimed at closing the gender gap in tech. Her company, which had started with just a handful of employees, now employed hundreds of people across the globe. She had created not just a business, but a culture, one that valued hard work, perseverance, and the willingness to push through adversity. But with success came more scrutiny. As Catherine's name became more well-known, people began to question the real story behind her transformation. The tabloids, once eager to celebrate her, began to take aim at her personal life, dredging up her past with Victor and painting her as a woman who had relied on a billionaire's connections to get ahead. The narrative that they tried to push was simple: she couldn't have done it alone. But Catherine was undeterred. She knew that her story was one of resilience, not one of charity. She had earned every ounce of her success. Her transformation wasn't about what she had lost in her past, it was about everything she had gained on her own. She was not going to let anyone define her by the man who had discarded her. One evening, as she sat in her office overlooking the city, Catherine received a call from Julian Cross, the CEO of the tech company she had worked with. He had been one of the first to recognize her potential and had invested in her business early on. The call was brief but impactful. "Catherine, I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of everything you've accomplished," Julian said. "You've turned your vision into a reality, and you've built something that will last. I'm happy to be part of your journey." Catherine smiled, touched by his words. Julian had been one of the few people who had truly believed in her, and it meant more than he could know. "Thank you, Julian," she replied. "But I couldn't have done it without the support of people like you. I've built this company, but it's the people around me, my team, my mentors, that have made this possible." The conversation ended with a promise to continue working together. Catherine felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. This wasn't just about personal success, it was about building a network of people who were committed to changing the world. She had created something bigger than herself, and now, she was ready to take it even further. Victor, meanwhile, continued to face challenges. His empire, once untouchable, was now facing financial difficulties. Investors were pulling out, and his personal relationships, strained by his arrogance and pride, were deteriorating. He had neglected the most important thing in business: people. He had focused so much on his wealth and status that he had forgotten about the human connections that had the power to build real success. As he sat in his office late one evening, watching the news reports about Catherine's latest achievements, he realized how much he had taken her for granted. She had been more than just a companion. She had been a partner, someone who had helped him grow and challenge himself. And now, she was outpacing him in every way. Catherine's success became more than just a personal journey, it became a cultural shift. She was no longer just a businesswoman or a self-made millionaire. She was the face of empowerment, the living proof that anyone, no matter their background, could achieve greatness. She wasn't just a victim of her past, she had transformed it into her power. And as the city watched her rise, there was no longer any doubt. Catherine had found herself. And she wasn't going to stop anytime soon. As Catherine's influence continued to grow, so did her responsibility to not only the company she had built but to the countless women who saw her as a beacon of hope. She wasn't just a business mogul anymore. She was a role model, a leader of a movement that was shifting the way the world viewed women in business, in leadership, and in society at large. But with this newfound status came unexpected challenges, ones that she hadn't fully anticipated when she started her journey. Her work-life balance had been difficult to maintain, and she found herself constantly juggling meetings, media appearances, and her personal commitments. There were days when the pressures seemed unbearable. Yet, Catherine was no stranger to adversity. She had learned early in life that the road to success was never easy, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth the effort. One particularly long evening, Catherine sat in her office overlooking the city lights, a soft hum of activity below her. It had been a productive day. She had closed a deal with a multinational corporation for a new partnership, But her thoughts kept drifting back to something that had been bothering her for weeks. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had achieved so much. She had built a business from the ground up, created job opportunities for women, and made a name for herself as a force to be reckoned with. But there was a nagging sense that her life wasn't complete. She had made her mark in the world of business, but at what cost? Her mind wandered back to the early days of her rise, to the times when she had found comfort and validation in Victor's world. The truth was, despite everything she had achieved, she still missed the companionship and the sense of partnership they once shared. She had built a life without him, but there was a part of her that had never fully healed from his rejection. Meanwhile, Victor had found himself at a crossroads. His company, once the pinnacle of his success, had begun to falter. His arrogance and ruthless decision-making had led to a series of poor investments, and his personal life was unraveling. He couldn't escape the deep regret he felt about Catherine. He had discarded her when she needed him most, assuming she would never amount to anything. Now, watching from the sidelines as she thrived, he couldn't help but question every decision he had made. Victor had never been a man who apologized, but in the quiet moments of his thoughts, he found himself haunted by the memory of Catherine's eyes when she walked away from him. He had been too proud to see what she was truly capable of, and now he was paying the price. At a high-profile gala, Victor found himself in the midst of a conversation with Julian Cross, the CEO of the tech company Catherine had partnered with early in her journey. Julian had become an influential figure in the tech world and was now helping Catherine expand her business internationally. Victor, who had once seen Julian as just another rival, now found himself seeking his advice. "Julian," Victor began, swirling his glass of whiskey thoughtfully. "I know I've made mistakes, but I can't shake the feeling that I've missed something. I should have recognized what Catherine had when I had the chance. But now, she's outpacing me in every way, and it stings. How do you do it? How do you stay ahead of the game?" Julian looked at him for a moment, weighing his words. "Victor, it's not about staying ahead of anyone else. It's about recognizing potential in people and empowering them. Catherine didn't need your approval. She's built something incredible on her own. But you were so focused on being the one with all the power that you couldn't see her strength. You pushed her away when you should have been supporting her." Victor felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had heard the same words from his closest colleagues, but hearing them from Julian stung in a way that made him realize how much he had truly lost. "I never thought she'd rise like this," Victor admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I can't undo the damage I've caused. How do I fix this? How do I make it right?" Julian leaned back, setting his glass down. "You can't fix it, Victor. All you can do is learn from your mistakes. You have to start putting people first. Maybe it's not too late to rebuild some relationships, but you'll never catch up to Catherine by simply following her. You need to find your own path." Victor sat in silence, contemplating the weight of Julian's words. He had once been the king of his world, but now he was just a man facing the consequences of his actions. Catherine had moved on, and he had no one to blame but himself. Back in her office, Catherine was looking at an email she had just received. It was an invitation to speak at an exclusive conference on women's leadership in Paris. The event promised to be one of the largest gatherings of influential women in the business world, and Catherine had been asked to share her story with an international audience. She felt a surge of excitement. This was a major opportunity, but it also felt like a defining moment. She had built her empire from nothing, but now she had the chance to speak on a global stage. Catherine quickly typed a response, accepting the invitation, before sitting back in her chair, reflecting on how far she had come. She had once been broken, but now she was whole. She had found her place in the world, and she was proud of the woman she had become. There were still days when the loneliness crept in, when she longed for the kind of love and companionship she had once shared with Victor. But those days were growing fewer and farther between. She had realized that she didn't need anyone else to complete her. She was already complete. As Catherine prepared for her upcoming speech, she spent time reflecting on the lessons she had learned during her journey. She had never expected her life to turn out the way it had. She had once believed that she was unworthy of love, of success, of the life she now led. But every setback had been a lesson, and every hardship had brought her one step closer to the woman she had become. She knew that she could never change the past. Victor was part of her history, but he no longer defined her. Her choices, her actions, were what had shaped her future. And now, she was standing on her own, a woman who had fought against the odds and had emerged victorious. As Catherine stood before a mirror, adjusting her dress for the Paris conference, she smiled. She was no longer the young woman who had been discarded. She was now the woman who had proven the world wrong. The night before the conference, Victor, sitting in his empty penthouse, found himself staring at an old photograph of Catherine. It was a picture from one of their last vacations together, and he could see the joy in her eyes. He remembered the promise he had made to himself to never settle, to never let someone like her get too close. But now, as he looked at the picture, he saw the truth. He had lost her, and it was because of his own arrogance. The regret was suffocating. He had taken Catherine for granted, assuming she would always be there, by his side, eager to please him. But now, she was thriving without him. She had surpassed him in ways he had never thought possible, and that truth haunted him. As Catherine took the stage in Paris, the crowd erupted in applause. She was no longer just a woman who had been dumped by a billionaire. She was now the face of empowerment, resilience, and independence. And as she spoke to the crowd about her journey, about the difficulties, the challenges, and the triumphs, she realized that the journey had been worth every struggle. She had earned her place in this world, and no one, not even Victor, could take that from her. As Catherine's influence spread across the world, the momentum behind her was unstoppable. Her company, once a small startup, now had offices in multiple countries, and her influence extended to countless communities where women were finding their voice and their path. However, with such power came new challenges, one she hadn't anticipated when she first set out on this journey. The tech industry was notoriously difficult for women, and as Catherine's company continued to grow, it attracted not only praise but also the occasional backlash. People who had once dismissed her as just a rich man's girlfriend now saw her as a genuine threat. Her success was a reminder to some that the world was changing, that women were no longer willing to settle for the roles society had prescribed for them. It wasn't long before Catherine found herself at the center of a fierce media storm. Some outlets hailed her as a visionary leader, while others questioned the methods behind her success. In the midst of this, her personal life also came under scrutiny. Reporters, always eager for a headline, dug into her past, trying to uncover anything that would tarnish the image of the woman who had once been discarded by the billionaire, now standing as one of the most powerful women in business. One particular evening, Catherine was sitting in her office, preparing for a conference call with potential investors. As she read through the daily news reports, one headline caught her eye: "Self-made billionaire's ex-girlfriend, the real story behind Catherine Morgan's success." It was another article trying to minimize her achievements by focusing on her past with Victor. Catherine's stomach churned as she skimmed through the words, most of which were distorted, untrue, and based purely on speculation. The article painted a picture of Catherine as someone who had only succeeded because of the connections she had made through Victor, ignoring the years of hard work, dedication, and grit she had put in to get to where she was. For a moment, she felt the familiar sting of insecurity. But then, something inside her shifted. She had been through too much to let something as petty as gossip and lies derail her. She had built this empire not with the help of others but through her own skills, determination, and perseverance. She had faced rejection, doubt, and betrayal, and she had turned it into fuel. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to the present. It was a message from her assistant, reminding her of the conference call in 15 minutes. Catherine took a deep breath, put the phone down, and stood up from her desk. This was her time. She wouldn't let anyone, not even the media, take that away from her. The conference call went as expected, and Catherine was able to secure a new round of funding that would help her company expand even further. But the success of the call was tempered by the fact that the media storm was intensifying. Each day brought new articles and opinions about her, and soon, she found herself at a crossroads. She had the power to silence her critics, to dismiss them with her success, but was that enough? Was success alone enough to prove her worth? In the quiet of her apartment later that night, Catherine found herself questioning the path she had taken. She had become a business leader, a trailblazer, a woman who had defied the odds. But somewhere along the way, she had lost the connection she once had with herself. Was this all worth it? She had gained everything, but had she lost herself in the process? In a private meeting with her closest advisors the next week, Catherine expressed these feelings of doubt. "I built this empire," she said, looking out over the skyline from the high-rise office. "But sometimes it feels like I've built it on the wrong foundation. It's not that I regret anything. It's just, what if the price of all this success is my own happiness?" Her team, a group of sharp, driven individuals who had supported her from the beginning, was quick to reassure her. "You've created something incredible," one of her advisors, Anna, said, her voice full of warmth. "You've inspired so many people, and you've proven that women can build something for themselves. You've shown the world what is possible. But if you're feeling empty, Catherine, maybe it's time to take a step back. You don't have to keep fighting this alone." Catherine nodded slowly. Anna's words rang true. She hadn't stopped to breathe in years. She had been so consumed by proving herself to the world that she had neglected her own well-being. Catherine wasn't just a business. She was a person, and maybe it was time for her to remember that. Around the same time, Victor was grappling with his own set of realizations. His company, once thriving under his leadership, had begun to show cracks. His business model, built on exploiting loopholes and focusing solely on the bottom line, was no longer sustainable. He had ignored the advice of his colleagues and had been blinded by his ego. Now, he was watching Catherine's meteoric rise from afar, a reminder of how badly he had misjudged both her and his own future. Victor had tried to move on after their breakup. He'd thrown himself into his work, focusing on expansion, acquisitions, and high-profile investments. But it was clear to him now that nothing he did could fill the void left by losing Catherine. She had been the one who had challenged him, who had made him better. She had been the one who, despite everything, saw potential in him. He'd underestimated her, and it had cost him everything. The day Catherine decided to take a break from the whirlwind of her professional life, she found herself walking through a quiet park, something she hadn't done in years. The peacefulness of the green spaces, the fresh air, and the sound of children playing brought her a sense of calm that had eluded her for so long. As she walked, she thought about the life she had built. She had everything she could ever want in terms of wealth, recognition, and influence, but she realized now that none of it mattered if she couldn't find a sense of balance. True happiness wasn't just about climbing to the top, it was about feeling fulfilled in every aspect of life. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Julian Cross, the CEO who had been by her side since the early days of her business. "I've got something exciting for you," the message read. "I just got off the phone with some top investors, and they're eager to partner with you for a major international expansion. They want to take your company global, Catherine. It's happening. Are you ready for this?" For a moment, Catherine stood still, staring at the screen. The offer was huge, an opportunity she had worked toward for years. It was the kind of opportunity that could push her company even further, cementing her place among the world's business elite. But this time, Catherine didn't rush to respond. Instead, she took a deep breath, thinking about the bigger picture. She realized that the decision wasn't just about business. It was about who she was becoming and what kind of leader she wanted to be moving forward. The next day, Catherine called Julian. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm going to take a step back for a while," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I've built something incredible, but now I need to focus on what truly matters. It's time for me to focus on myself, on who I am, not just what I've built." Julian was surprised, but he respected her decision. "I get it. You've worked hard for everything you've achieved. Take the time you need, Catherine. We'll be here when you're ready to take the next step." As Catherine hung up the phone, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had spent so much time proving herself to the world, but now it was time to prove something to herself, that she didn't need to be everything to everyone. She didn't need to be constantly striving for more. She had already achieved more than she ever dreamed possible. It was time to find peace and rediscover the parts of her life she had left behind. Catherine's decision to step back from the relentless pace of business was not easy, but it was necessary. As the weeks passed, she felt herself rediscovering parts of her life that had been lost in the pursuit of success. She began to engage in activities she had once enjoyed but had abandoned, like painting, yoga, and even volunteering at local shelters. She surrounded herself with people who reminded her of the importance of connection, people who didn't see her as a businesswoman, but simply as Catherine, the person. For the first time in a long while, she found peace. She wasn't constantly checking emails, attending meetings, or answering calls. Her days were no longer dictated by the demands of investors, partners, or the media. Instead, she focused on her own well-being, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. She spent afternoons at the park, evenings with friends, and weekends traveling to places she had always wanted to visit. One afternoon, while Catherine was walking through Central Park in New York, she received a call from Julian Cross. It had been weeks since they last spoke about business, and she had been focused on her personal journey. "Catherine, I know you've been taking time for yourself," Julian began, his voice warm but businesslike. "But I've got something important that I think you'll want to hear." Catherine paused for a moment, considering his words. She had worked hard to create space for herself, but she knew that the world didn't stop just because she had. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone more curious than anxious. "We've been approached by a major international conglomerate," Julian continued. "They want to partner with you for an expansion that could take your company global." "This is big, Catherine, bigger than anything we've done so far." Catherine listened intently, her mind already running through the possibilities. The offer was exciting, but she had learned a valuable lesson during her time away from the office. Success was no longer about the size of the opportunity or the money it could bring. It was about alignment, about staying true to the values that had driven her from the beginning. "I appreciate the opportunity, Julian," Catherine said, her voice steady. "But right now, I'm focusing on something else. I want to make sure that any decision I make is authentic to what I believe in. I'm not just going to jump on the next big thing because it looks good." Julian seemed to understand, and for a moment, there was a silence between them. "I get it. I just wanted to make sure you were aware of it. Take your time, Catherine. We're here when you're ready." Catherine hung up the phone, her thoughts swirling. The temptation to jump back into the hustle was strong, but the clarity she had gained over the past few months told her that this moment was not about seizing every opportunity. It was about being intentional, about aligning her actions with her deeper values. Meanwhile, Victor was still struggling to find his footing. His company was in turmoil, and his relationships, both professional and personal, had soured. His ego, once his driving force, had now become his burden. He found himself questioning everything, from his business decisions to his treatment of Catherine. It had been months since he last saw her, and despite all of his attempts to move on, he couldn't escape the truth. He had lost her. And worse, he had lost the part of himself that had once been filled with passion and purpose. He had buried his own dreams beneath the weight of his arrogance, and now, it was catching up with him. He spent long nights in his office, alone with his thoughts, as the city buzzed outside his window. The guilt was unrelenting, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen from the man he once was. He had pushed away the one person who had truly understood him, and now, that person was thriving without him. One evening, after a particularly rough day at the office, Victor decided to take a walk. He found himself on the same street where he had once walked with Catherine, just before they had gone their separate ways. He remembered the conversations they had, the dreams they shared, and how he had dismissed her so easily. As he walked, he passed a small bookstore and stopped in front of the window. A book caught his eye, The Art of Self-Reflection. He had never been one to dive deep into self-help or personal growth books, but something about this one seemed to resonate with him. He walked inside and bought it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it could offer him the answers he had been searching for. As the weeks went by, Catherine continued to focus on her personal growth. She started working with a life coach who helped her refine her goals and vision for the future. The work wasn't easy, but it was essential. She had to confront her fears, her doubts, and her past in order to move forward. One evening, after a particularly emotional coaching session, Catherine sat on the balcony of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She had come a long way from the woman who had been discarded by Victor. She had built an empire, transformed her life, and found her true purpose. But now, as she looked out over the city, she felt the weight of the next step in her journey. What was the next chapter? She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew she wasn't done. The world had changed, and so had she. Catherine was no longer just a product of her circumstances. She was the architect of her own destiny. Meanwhile, Victor was slowly starting to make changes. He began reading the book he had bought, and for the first time in years, he found himself questioning the choices he had made. The book wasn't just about business, it was about personal transformation, about understanding who you were at your core and learning to embrace vulnerability. For the first time, he began to understand why Catherine had always challenged him. She had been the one who had seen the potential in him, the one who had pushed him to be better. But instead of being grateful, he had pushed her away, thinking he didn't need anyone. Victor wasn't sure if it was too late to change, but he knew that he had to start somewhere. And that somewhere was within himself. As time passed, Catherine began to expand her network, attending events focused on global entrepreneurship, leadership, and social impact. She began meeting other leaders who shared her passion for empowerment and sustainability. These interactions inspired new ideas for her company, ideas that would not only further her mission but also bring about significant positive change in the world. One day, while at an event in New York, Catherine was approached by a woman who was a part of a nonprofit organization that worked with women in developing countries. The woman's name was Isabella, and she had heard about Catherine's work through the media. Isabella was passionate about bringing business opportunities to women who lived in extreme poverty, and she wanted Catherine's help. "I've been following your journey, Catherine," Isabella said, her voice warm. "Your story is one of resilience and strength. I believe we can work together to create something that could change the lives of women in Africa and South Asia. What do you think?" Catherine was intrigued by the idea. She had always wanted to expand her work to support women in underserved regions, but she hadn't yet figured out how to make that leap. Now, it seemed the opportunity had arrived. "I'm in," Catherine said, her heart pounding with excitement. "Let's make it happen." As the partnership with Isabella's nonprofit began to take shape, Catherine felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was what she had been missing, the chance to impact lives on a global scale, not just through business, but through social change. And as she moved forward, Catherine realized something important. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to have everything figured out. What mattered was that she was staying true to herself, following her heart, and continuing to make a difference in the world.